Today, Richard Spoor Incorporated filed an application for certification for a class action against the global mining companies South 32, BHP Billiton and Seriti Power. The applicants are seeking legal remedies for miners who contracted coal mine dust lung disease as a result of long and often unprotected exposure to coal dust in mines. The dependents of deceased workers who contracted the illness are also being represented. RSI says the companies have breached the legal duties owed to the miners by failing to implement statutory mandated procedures and protections. And for more on this, we are now joined by Dasantha Pillay, who is the instructing attorney for coal class action case brought to court by Richard Spoor Incorporated coal miners file class action. Of course, Dasantha, thank you so much for joining us here on the late edition. Of course, we understand that coal miners are indeed taking at least 3 mining giant companies to court in a class action lawsuit. Tell us why they've resorted to this.
Well, as you pointed out, today Richard Spoor launched a class action against 3 mining companies, South 32, BHP Billiton and Seriti. Ultimately, we are representing coal mine workers who wish to hold these companies accountable for causing them to contract this illness.
And maybe, if you can give us a bit of insight, what prompted this? I know that you're saying that there are mine workers who contracted, these various diseases while they were working. And I understand this even dates back to at least in the 1960s. When it comes to this issue, how many coal miners did you, were able to gather to be part of this class action lawsuit?
Well, this is 1 in 4 of the class actions that we plan to launch.
All right. And maybe if you can also just give us a bit of information there when it comes to, we know that many of these miners, Dasantha, when it comes to families, it's indeed their children and their wives back home who often would suffer the ramifications of, these kinds of diseases. And of course, if it led to their deaths, maybe just give us a bit of insight there when it comes to, how families have suffered and, as a result, based on these various diseases.
Well, there's various impacts on the families, and the first that I'd like to talk about is actually the effect of looking after somebody who has this illness. And often what we find is that women bear the brunt of looking after ailing mine workers who return home. This sometimes leads to having to drop out of school, having to spend time permanently at home. And then the other element is obviously then a loss of dependence.
And perhaps
because many families rely on the salary of these mine workers.
And perhaps if maybe you can also give us an insight in terms of what specific allegations, will you be bringing to this legal action when it's heard in court?
So there are numerous, but ultimately what we argue is that these mining companies have breached the various regulations under the Mines and Works Act, the Mine Health and Safety Act, and what we call ODIMWA. These pieces of legislation were enacted to protect mine workers and to ensure that there was a safe occupational working space. This includes things like regulations around ventilation, dust suppression, health surveillance. These mining companies have not adhered to this legislation.
And maybe, Dasantha, let's also then talk about the class action lawsuit, the certification process. What are the steps will you be taking now? We know that you filed those papers today. What will be the next process from here onwards?
Well, as you know, a class action is a legal case that's brought on behalf of a group of people who have a common interest or common grievance, and they're represented in court by a class. We are now applying for certification of that group, of that class. The next step will actually be for the mining companies to decide how they want to proceed. It is perfectly within their power to accept the class and to proceed to the certification of that class. But that is in their hands. They can also choose to defend the case.
All right, then, Dasantha, thank you so much for your time.